Next we're going into budget priorities.
Yes, at your direction, sir, if that's the next
Okay.
agenda item you want to cover.
Next item's 8, budget priorities. This is important. Right now we've talked about priorities, and go ahead, Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones. Will you let the board know our expectations?
Yes, sir.
On this portion of the agenda?
Yes, sir. Thank you. This process starts almost immediately after each session, and what this process is in accordance with the Budgetary Procedures Act. Typically, by the first part of October, the law requires that the board make a budget proposal to the governor's office, which he then subsequently, around probably the first week of December, turns over to the legislature. The process has evolved over time, so this is my 4th year here in this position and doing this, and so the iterations were pretty much are on the same line. I just wanted to show you, so 4 years ago, this is what I looked like when I first presented this to you and before we had 2, so just want to make sure that everybody knows that. I better get off of this really quick. So
you still have that scarf, don't you?
Yeah, I do, and that's before we had the table mic, so the 2. So hey, I was taught to have an attention getter, right? To keep everybody focused on that too. So I'll do that too. I'll write my own letter of reprimand. Okay, so here we go. This is a great process. It's an iterative process again that starts typically out of the legislative session, where staff get with you and we look at what we achieved or the funding that we received in the session, and then we come out and we start to really align strategically our funding requests with your strategic plan. It's just great developments, especially since Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley came on. We're really excited. I'll speak for myself as a staff member. I'm really excited and focused on getting or obtaining the resources that are so needed and necessary for our educators to serve each of our individual students. So with that, what we arrive at is the budget proposal, and then after the governor makes his proposal, we typically, and I just want to orient you to this real quick, this is a side-by-side comparison that we've landed on or arrived at for the purposes of this meeting. After the last meeting, Vice Chair Cummins and Board Member Hanson approached me and said, hey, Scott, can we put together something that's a little bit neater than that wonky spreadsheet you put together with all those green colors on it and all that? So kudos to Tiffany Stanley and her staff, Barbara Fuentes, for putting this information together. Why this is important is because as we get into next week's Public Education Appropriations Committee, the respective chairs of the committee, Senator Hilliards and Representative Elison, will likely, consult with both you as board members, the superintendent, myself, and then also the governor's office on what becomes prioritization based on what the revenue estimate is, or what the revenue is coming down at. And I'm not sure that we actually have the concrete specific number at this point going into next week. But at this time every year, at this board meeting that you have in early February, we as staff try to get with you to ensure that at this meeting you start to develop your prioritizations for the funding that you've requested. And we feel that it's a value add to have the governor's recommendations or the side-by-side comparisons. And this year's a little bit unique. In prior years, it's been pretty much all new money. I'd say the biggest takeaway for all of you on this comparison is that your request, and I'll scroll to the bottom of this particular tool or resource for you, is you're requesting a grand total of approximately $353,291,300 of new money, where the governor's recommendation grand total is higher. However, what's I feel is different, Natalie can correct me if I'm wrong, what's a little bit different about this year is the governor has different ideas or has proposed different ways to fund the total than we are. We're actually asking pretty much for all new money. And this has been because it's an iterative process, there's some philosophical aspects of this too. There's some that believe that public education in the state of Utah is underfunded entirely. So each year, in accordance or in support of your strategic plan, we should seek new money. There's others that feel like, well, when you have balances or you have these type of opportunities, I guess, i.e. maybe perhaps from the governor's office, I can't speak for them, but they'll look at it like, well, let's try to find ways to fund with existing money. Nothing is wrong. There's not a wrong or right approach to that. I just want to make sure that I feel that that's probably a distinguishing difference this year, is that what we're asking for is all new money, is completely new money, whereas there's existing funding that the governor's proposal would use to fund to the level that they're requesting, the approximately the $471 million. What we also try to do, and if I can go back up to the top of this report, or hopefully you're with me in the backups or you're following on the screen, is, we make the column on the right-hand side so that you can look at what you've proposed, enrollment growth, 1.02%, so I'm back at the top. And then you look at their recommendations and what the differences are. As it pertains to growth, and Natalie can correct me if I'm wrong on this too, we all arrive at the same number. We're both requesting $35,600,000, and this is by way of a process called the Common Data Committee that convenes roughly in November, that consists of representatives from your from your office staff, and from the governor's office and from the legislative fiscal analyst. And we arrive at these approximations or estimates of what it would cost to fund growth. Key takeaway from this too is for planning purposes and for your consideration, this year we equate a 1% increase to the value of the WPU as $32 million. Okay, so when you look at 1.02, you do the math, it should be 32 million plus that 0.02% is roughly the 35,600,000. Okay, so we're on the same page there. The governor proposed a 4% increase to the value of the WPU. 4%.
Hang on one sec.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Board Member Ellis?
Okay.
Scott,
Okay.
you
Am I
made
boring
this. No, you made
Okay.
this so that it should be more readable.
Okay.
But there's a label missing somewhere, or else
Okay.
I'm missing something,
Sure.
because you're saying that we both arrived at the same number,
Right.
but you have governor's recommendations labeled as 14.7. And
Yes.
so is this the amount and ongoing our request?
Go ahead.
So that, how are they both the same number if that we were asking 30?
Right. It goes to what I said. It's the technique or the way they want to fund it, and Natalie will expand on that.
Okay, but 14.7 million plus 4.2 million doesn't add up to 30.
Right.
So I guess I just,
No, yep, you got it. That's fine.
Okay,
That's a
Natalie?
great question.
So this is I'm glad that you asked the question, because that was, I think, what made it so difficult to put this sheet together this year. If you think about it in this context, the Board of Education, we calculated the cost of growth with the group, and we all agreed on the cost of growth. So the CDC agreed upon the $35,600,000 as the cost of growth. You, as the Board of Education, recommended that we seek new funds to fund that. The governor's office used a different technique. So the reason there's only $14 million and then some one-time money associated with this is that they were choosing to sweep the carryover balances in the voted and board programs to fund
Okay.
the cost of growth. So growth would still be funded. It's just where the money comes
so
from.
it's all those columns below on
Yes.
the governor's side. Thank you.
Right. And that's it too. Because it's so new this year, and this is an iterative process. I started at the top and would scroll down, but yeah.
Thank you.
So
I
go
appreciate
ahead. Yeah.
So just for those who haven't done this before, when we finally balance out the voted and board guarantee programs, we have to do that at the end of the year because we have to wait for tax collections, property tax collections to come in. And that comes in at the very end of the year. We generally do have a surplus or a carryover balance in some of those programs. The legislature generally, and they don't always, sometimes it depends on the situations that are going on, they have the option to sweep those carryover balances and use them to fund other things. There are some provisions in some various programs that indicate if we do have a remaining carryover balance, we distribute those to our LEAs. So the fiscal analyst's office is very mindful of not letting money sit around. right? If there's money that we can get out into the public schools, they want that out and not just hanging out in an account somewhere. And so again, this is a technique that I haven't seen in the years that I've been here before, is carryover funds using to, at least the transparency. When it all gets swept and the budget gets balanced at the end, you don't really know whether it's new money or carryover money that was swept. And so this is just a little more transparent than it has been in the past.
We're trying to get to that point, always transparent. So with that WPU increase difference, ours is a 5.5% proposal. His is a 4% proposal. And you'll see that given the 32 million equals 1%, if you take roughly 32 million, it's approximate. That's what the governor's ongoing amount is. 32 million times 4 is that amount. Now remember, these are all broken down, and the comparatives are all aligned with what has been previously decided by the board as categorical requests. So category A is growth in the WPU, and now we head into what is titled category B, which is LEA funding. So then there's the Safe and Healthy Schools proposal, 66 million one time. Your proposal, 66 million one time, and 36,397,700. Then what we did is because there's a lot of similarity behind discussions that have occurred on what that money could be used for. Again, I'm not saying it would be used for that, mandating it or anything like that. We broke it out a little bit further into these categories, and that helps more align what the governor was proposing that in his proposal that the funding be used for. Again, here I think we were very relatively close in what we were requesting for that specific purpose, but they broke it out a little bit more in detail on, school counseling, the flexible allocation piece, and Natalie can speak to the flexible allocation, the capital outlay, which, foundation program, which would be likely used for the hardening. You heard that term of the schools, is that right, Nat? So, yeah, you'll hear those terms and all that, and so that's what we tried to do here as well. Is we tried to say, okay, you've requested the new money, and then this in the governor's proposal that went to the legislature, they did as well for this specific purpose, but it's broken out in a little bit more that way. The board proposed for from transportation an additional $5 million of new money. The governor did not have that in his proposal. The NES was $500,000, not in his proposal. However, the governor did propose what's called or titled WPU add-on for rural students. That's $3 million there. And then an add-on for students at risk of academic failure, the amount that you see in the right-hand column. A little bit, again, broken out into more specific categories. Then we proceed down to his request. I'll go drop down to educator bonuses. And I think the key takeaway with this one that I can give you is he's proposing $30 million, which is just slightly below the $32 million 1% for the WPU. So if you wanted to consider that proposal and, when we get into starting to prioritize and how much you've requested the value of the WPU increase by 5.5%, these are some considerations that are value added as well. The Talent Ready for K-12 technology curriculum. You had an earlier briefing on that. Board members or the board also proposed school nurses, $5 million. We haven't got to this particular item yet in public education appropriations. We anticipate that'll be next week. We did cover certified teacher librarians. Board member Gravitt was there for that presentation. Thank you, ma'am, as well as leadership. University of Utah reading clinics has not been covered yet. We did cover statewide advising corps, your proposal for that to support the higher education ask. We haven't covered the Sorensen Arts Learning Program amount yet. One key takeaway from that is my understanding is the $1.5 million is all flow through to the LEAs. There wouldn't be an administrative part of that or function of that. There was the intervention for reading difficulties, which Jennifer Thronsden testified to you yesterday on, that we added. And then last month you were also briefed on ICE, which has also been covered in public education appropriations. Then we scroll down to some what we call conversions, which there was money that was the legislature had provided for these two particular programs, the Learn platform, which we did have covered in public education appropriations, and I don't think we got to the competency base today, did we? That'll be next week as well. What we did here is we're just requesting that the legislature allocate ongoing amounts rather than one-time amounts for those specific purposes at your direction. That concludes the Category B proposals that you gave, and then the comparisons with the governor's proposal. Category C is strictly USDB funding, and then Category D is our office budget, basically funding that stays here to support, and along the lines of the USIMS, Utah Schools Information Management System, and a school land trust section budget. Both have been covered in public education appropriations, and as probably was stated earlier, the bill that you just reviewed today passed out of the Senate committee unanimously for funding for the Utah Schools Information Management System. So again, that's how we arrive at the grand totals, a comparison of both proposals. We don't know what the revenue amounts are, but for planning purposes, you could say something around 300 million. And then we start this process, this iterative process, and I'm going to defer to or tap into Vice Chair Cummins on this one, is because we talked a little bit about this before, where we start the process of your prioritization, because inevitably we do, and we always get asked by the chairs of public education appropriation, because they have to, at some point in the session, turn around and make their proposals to executive appropriations. They ask for ours and the governor's priorities.
We have a couple of questions before we dive into this, I believe. Board Member Lear?
I know I'm moving fast.
Thank you. Yeah, you and it's numbers, so you can't go that fast.
No, okay, I'm sorry, ma'am. I know there's time.
Totally kidding. Asking your expert opinion, you mentioned teacher bonuses in our budget versus the no teacher bonuses in the governor's budget.
No,
but
flipped, ma'am. Yes.
So in your opinion, is one better than the other, or?
In my opinion, so I'm going to take a math approach to this first, and Natalie's going to help me with this. And also the superintendent. So I'm estimating that my understanding is there's roughly about 28,000 in classroom educators. Is that about right? So now if you take $30 million, right, and even if, so here's the thing. I'm not aware of what the distribution plan is specifically for the governor. But if we do the math on this, then Natalie, go ahead. What is it?
Well, so I attended a meeting where we had some conversation about what the potential plan would be. So just for some context, the governor's proposal is the educator bonuses would be one-time money. It would be $30 million that would be distributed to LEAs in some sort of equitable format, whether that would be based on WPUs or through the flex allocation. That hasn't been decided, but it is one-time money. And so that would be available to the conversation that we had is whether that was educators, all LEA employees, if those would be focused or targeted to areas of criticality, if they would be targeted at rural areas. There hasn't, to my knowledge, been a decision at that point, but
That's what I heard too. Okay. Right. So, but just on a strict, straight line, 28,000 educators in the classroom, which I know doesn't account for all of our educators, all of our licensed. What's 30 million divided by 28,000, Nat? So
30 million. $1,000.
Okay, so that's about $1,000. Now here's the thing too. So here's my expert opinion. My expert opinion is that what's more valuable to anyone, not just an educator, is a salary increase, right? Because bonuses are great, and they're recognizing that, but from a retirement standpoint or process with that, then by way of comparison, I mean, I don't take a stand on what's right or wrong, but I just want you to consider that typically increases in the value of the WPU, not entirely, do help with salary increases and all too. So that's why earlier I was looking at, you've asked for a 5.5%. It's okay for you to consider how you'd like to, what you would like to see go into that if we wanted to sustain that. Does that make sense? Because bonuses are fine, they're great. However, salary increases typically benefit anyone, an educator or a staff member more.
Can I follow up?
If that's okay, if I may say that.
Well, and no, I appreciate you being honest and direct with me, but So am I understanding in more simple terms that within the WPU would be ongoing and the bonuses would be one time?
Yes.
Would that be accurate?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think it's maybe worth noting that we had a fabulous math teacher in front of us somehow taking care of 4 kids when we've got to figure out some way to, earlier this morning, that we would love to be able to keep him as a math teacher. I had one more related, not completely, this is just a yes/no question though, Chair, if I can. You talked about the, and I forget the name of it all of a sudden, the
back up on-
technology program coming out of the Senate today with the unanimous.
That was the USIB system.
Right.
Not today, earlier this week.
Right, with
Yeah.
the full amount of money, was it
Yes,
completely?
17.2 million, yes,
Perfect.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes. It's just, it's out of the Senate Ed Committee on the floor now, is my
Right.
understanding.
Thank you.
So, yes, ma'am.
Board Member Ellis?
Thank you. This is unrelated to that, but I'm just wondering, we don't have a request or anything in for an end-to-end system that has been
No.
talked about occasionally, and I'm just wondering if you could give me a ballpark of what you think we should,
Sure.
if we were to explore that, what that
Right.
would look like.
End-to-end systems, when we say the term Enterprise Resource Planning System, ERP, ERPs are made of what's called modules, okay? And an ERP can consist of typically at least 2 modules, but anywhere from 2 to 8 modules. So anytime you increase the amount of modularization that occurs in an enterprise resource planning system, your costs are likely to go up. 2.5 years ago, we embarked on a study where we got as much information as we possibly could from LEAs on how much they had invested to date in their own ERP configurations, which the basic ERP configuration in public education in Utah, I would say, and Natalie chime in on this, is pretty much a financial system, a student system, and
Potentially a procurement system.
procurement system. HR. So what we proposed back 2.5 years ago was this. We said, let's look at an end-to-end system that consists of financial, student, procurement, grants, and also look at the feasibility of if there's a majority of, or not a majority, if there's several LEAs that are in one type or particular module of the ERP, like a financial system, it could be cost effective to ask that the remainder of the LEAs go into that system. So based on that, we approximated or estimated about an $80 million ask for financial, student, procurement, and grants. Back then, we were given by the legislature roughly about $4.2 million. And since then, we've used that funding to get all of the LEAs in the grants system. So that's all we were given out of that particular funding. And you may ask, well, God, how do you go from 80 to 4.2 in a grant system? Really, the bigger costs were of trying to put everybody into all one financial system and all one student information system. All the training that would take based on what feedback we'd got from some of our higher economies of scale districts like your Alpines and all that, who'd spent excess of millions of dollars to get into their own systems respectively. So a long answer to a short question. It does depend. And what we did is we provided a side-by-side comparison on what USIMS gets us and then what additional end-to-end capabilities we could realize. And the range on that is $80 to $300 million. And I know that can be frustrating, but having been experienced going into an end-to-end system with Department of the Army, not at the highest levels, but at a pretty high level, worldwide they spent billions of dollars and they just focused on a financial end-to-end system. And a lot does depend on whether you go in an Oracle-based or an SAP-based, and so we did it approximate it as much as we could to look at what it would cost to arrive at what's called an enterprise resource planning system made up of specific modules for public education.
Okay, what about just the financial aspect?
And the financial aspect, I would say that would range anywhere between 10 to 30 to $40 million, and this is just based on what information I had back then, and here's why. Because a decision would have to be made. Again, for instance, there's 27 districts, that are all in the same financial system or the same brand. So if we said, well, you know, put everybody in that one, that would be less than it would be if we went out and did an RFP and said, you know, let's go and put everybody into a different one. Does that make sense? So we're always trying to look at what would amount to being more cost effective. And that's why as staff, we give you a range. It's not to try to be evasive, or it's just what problem are we trying to solve, which I think we're pretty good about telling or advising what problems end-to-end systems would solve. But then again, it's what's, you know, how big do you want to make that ERP, and how many modules do you want in the ERP? But let me leave you with this. The board did propose, if I may, Chair, real quick, just to tie up the answer here to Board Member Ellis's question, is regardless if we went into an end-to-end just financial or an end-to-end student information system, we still need the infrastructure that's USIMS. So if we did an $80 million estimate and we got the modules that I explained to you earlier that made up the $80 million, $17 million of that would still go to getting our systems realigned or compacted to serve that ERP concept, if that makes sense. So 80 minus 17 million, or, you know, 120 million minus 17 million. It's just that bad with our infrastructure. We have no choice. We have to get our infrastructure taken care of, and that's my answer.
So there's a lot of sticker shock on this, and on the Hill,
Yes.
they're asking a lot of the same questions, and those that were around I think it was 2.5 years ago it started. That $80 million was out there, and it depends on how robust the system is, and there's a whole lot of what ifs with, you know, the challenge was we get our house in order, then all the LEAs have to get their house in order in a system, and it lost traction. And so part of our board priorities was, well, hey, let's get our house in order first with a robust system, and because that would be the first step of doing an $80 to $300 million system. So that's how we got where we're at. Board Member Bolter.
I was writing down. I didn't think you'd come to me so quickly. I have a question. I was told that the WPU increase that the governor is asking for is 4%, right?
Yes.
So then I was looking at the two add-ons. It says WPU add-on for rural students, and then there's another add-on for students at risk of academic failure. Is that also a WPU add-on?
So in the governor's proposal right now, these would be new programs that don't currently exist, and they don't have it all worked out as to how those where they would go, how they would be distributed. They're just concepts right now, and to my knowledge, that hasn't been worked out yet.
So that would be a potential 0.6% for the add-ons. So his budget would be, his WPU actual ask would be 4.6% approximately, but is he saying that he wants this other 0.6% allocated to the startup of those two budgets, or how does that work?
So it
just trying to
depends on
understand the
where
WPU add-on.
it depends on where they land. So if you look at the oh goodness, where is it? It depends on if you put those add-ons into the basic program or whether they go below the line. So if they turn into or become part of the related to basic program, then no, they wouldn't be part of the WPU increase.
Oh, okay.
But if they go above the line, then they
Then
would.
they would be.
And
Oh,
that's
okay.
one of the conversations that's occurring. Above the line is also funded partially with property tax.
Right.
Below the line is 100% state funded. So
Okay.
there are some policy discussions as to how they would be funded, where they would live, and if the money would be directed at specific populations.
Oh, okay. So when it says WPU add-on, it's not necessarily like we're going to add it on just yet.
I believe
discussion.
that was the initial proposal from the
Okay.
governor's office. But there is no bill or
Or anything.
anything to carry that right now. And to create a program like that, you'd have to have statutory language to do so.
Okay, thanks.
Board Member Hanson, Linda Hanson.
So have we seen a bill that has to do with the educator bonuses yet?
Not that I'm aware of,
And
no.
then a follow-up, just a concern that, or just a public statement, let's say it that way, that just because we did the math and said it's about $1,000 per teacher, doesn't mean it necessarily would be, because
No.
we've seen other times where secondary teachers got more than elementary teachers and all
Right.
of those kinds of things, so that's
And
not. yes.
benefits and taxes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Chair, yeah, so great question. I was just doing that just as a simple math formula. Yes, we always say this, the devil's in the details, right? About, going back to what Natalie was explaining coming out of that meeting, is that those would be the decisions, is how far do you go? Do you go beyond, 28,000 and then, yes, it's subject to taxes and back to Board Member Lear's question, my recommendation would always be to facilitate the salary, increases on that too, because then it has impacts or benefits that for the individual in longer term. So,
Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Scott, maybe as far as the bonuses, I recall Representative Christensen's bill that does something like that, or I'm sorry, Christopherson's bill, doesn't that
Okay.
make up for that? Because I know he's been trying to run that it's not the same?
It's not the same, ma'am.
Okay.
No.
All right,
No, ma'am.
thank you.
Okay. Board Member Davis. And then
It-
Brittany Cummings.
I hope this is the appropriate time to ask this question. So there is a lot of talk about broadening the base and lowering the rate, and talk about lowering the income tax rate to 4.5%. Has that been drafted, and is there a fiscal note? No, it's this year. It's this year. So could you I know this isn't part of this particular presentation, but could you let us know financially how that would impact what we're talking about here? And I don't know if it would be too late to change any of this, and maybe it wouldn't, but it would be good to know what we're looking at as far as financial impact.
If I may clarify, so I think what you're talking about is what has been termed the restructuring of the tax. Is that right? Okay. Do you want to talk to that? So.
To my knowledge, the bill hasn't come out for us to respond to.
Board members, if we can pay attention to the speaker, please, I'd appreciate it. I'm having a hard time hearing the speaker. Thank you.
To my knowledge, I haven't seen a bill that we respond to. What usually happens in tax bills is that we rely on the tax commission to quantify the impact. Because keep in mind, if there are adjustments to income tax, it also affects corporate franchise tax and various other areas that still go into the education fund but react differently than just regular income tax. I know one of the reasons that we have such a large surplus this year are changes in the tax code. And so they're trying to be quite conservative, according to what I've heard so far, as to what we obligate in ongoing money and one-time money to ensure that that base can be retained. When that comes up, we will definitely put that on the list for the board meeting. We can put that on for board meetings that happen weekly and apprise you as those bills arrive and what the impacts are quantified to be.
So, Chair, in the interest of time, if we could just
Let me
cut
go one
right
more-
to
one more com-
prioritization.
One more
Okay,
comment.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah,
or
sure.
question.
Yes, sir.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Sure. Okay.
So I'd like to, I have a potential motion, but I'd like to chat about it first, if that's okay.
Okay.
Is that okay? I know that the legislature is looking at the TSSA
Yes.
account, and they're wanting to put some money in it, and we haven't really acknowledged that in our current budget recommendations. And I'm wondering what flexibility we want to give to our staff as they speak with legislators about the budget in order to prioritize how much funding we like to see in the WPU and how much would go into the TSSA account using our 5.5% ask. So it's kind of a question with a thought of, if we are sticking hard with the 5.5 in the WPU, are they going to remove that, or are we going to kind of cooperate with the context of, that we recognize that this new account exists and there is going to be money going in that direction?
Okay. Superintendent.
So, Scott, you may want to explain what is in the budget already for that account, and then
That's gonna
how
be-
much, what would that look like with the WPU being roughly around 32 million, just so the whole board understands what that would mean if we did negotiate those
Okay.
percentages.
Go ahead.
So I will double check and make sure that I'm accurate, but I'm fairly certain, like 99% certain, that the funds that were appropriated last year that were kind of in flux for the TSSA account were put into the base budget, into the flexible allocation budget again.
Yes, that's true.
I believe that the base budget passed yesterday. Is that correct? That obviously doesn't mean that
Wednesday.
funds couldn't be moved.
Or
but-
yesterday. Yeah, you're right.
But right now, I think that the context of the bill that's in question deals with how those funds would be distributed. There's a formula in that bill that determines how the allocation would work, and I think if the board wanted to make recommendations that were different than were in that bill, it's
Follow
Senate
up.
Bill 149?
Now we define what the TSSA.
So my
Oh,
question,
TSSA.
We need to define what the TSSA is. Okay, good.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I forgot.
No, no.
So TSSA in legislation last year, HB 239, I believe, created different levels. I'll try to do it really quick. It created different levels of property tax. So we fund the basic school program, the above the line program, at a certain level. There were layers added upon that level that property tax increases got peeled off and put in specific restricted accounts. That's about as simple as I can get. $18 million of that goes into the teacher student success account. It's a restricted account that is generated from saved state money because local property taxes are increasing and LEAs are collecting more. So state programs cost us less to fund. There was an additional 40-something million dollars that was set aside. It was state revenue, completely state revenue, that was appropriated to the flexible allocation account as part of the Our Schools Now negotiation. That was kind of in flux while the constitutional amendment was being considered. So that funds didn't sit aside and weren't being used anywhere or wasted during the year, they appropriated that into the flexible allocation program. And the 18 million and the 40 million combined to make the 65 that you're hearing about. And that was distributed through flexible allocation in this current year right now. The item that is in question is what happens to that money now. Currently, the way that the statute is set up, all of the property tax increases that are associated with the weighted people unit or the weighted people unit value increase still go into that TSSA account. The $40 million that was kind of a placeholder that was appropriated into flexible allocation in the base budget bill went back to flexible allocation. Trying to determine how to allocate those funds and if that will be moved out of flexible allocation, I believe, is the question that you're asking, and if the board wants to make a different recommendation.
okay.
Follow up.
Actually, my question isn't in regard to the distribution of the funds, but I'd heard that there was a possibility that they were actually going to use that account to funnel new funding, like new funds into the TSSA account and not use necessarily put all of the money in the WPU.
I did hear that, yeah.
Superintendent.
Yeah, so just, I think if I'm interpreting what you're saying, right? So let's say that there's 65 million set aside, thinking that's going to come into the TSSA account, and other money that people are looking at, somebody says, okay, let's bump that up to 100 million because we know that will go right to classrooms. I'm just like piecing together rumors that are floating on the hill.
Yeah.
So where would that additional money come from? Well, obviously it's going to come from places where there's negotiating power. So we're saying 5.5 on the WPU, the governor's office saying 4, others are saying 3. So
Yeah.
if $32 million equates to 1% on the WPU, then I think, if I'm correct, Vice Chair Cummins, what you're asking is for you as a board to give us wiggle room to move from that 5.5 to 3% or 4% or 4.5, depending on what the negotiations are
okay.
to get to adding to the TSSA versus our ask for 5.5. Did I get that semi-correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, all right. I don't have Natalie's numbers speak, but I think that's what we're asking.
So that.
No, I see, yeah, okay, so if I may, Joe,
Jeff, you can speak to
I
that.
did hear about that, too, so now I see what you're saying as well, so, okay.
So, to Board Member, Vice Chair Brittany Cummings' point is, we or staff and also leadership in that, we have our priorities, we're sticking to it. That's our narrative, that's our narrative, that's our narrative, 5.5. But we might be called upon to say, hey, are you okay if a bunch of this money is in the TSSA, a certain amount, and are you okay lowering your WPU? It's almost like a compromise. Or does the board or do we just take this clear to the end, 5.5, 5.5? I think,
That's the question, yes.
that's exactly where we're at. And so
Right.
in our budgeting, we have marching orders, of board priorities, what the board's decided to do. And I guess the question was, do you want to move that to just hold the line on a 4.4 or 4.5 or something if this is how it goes, or do we oppose it? And or we just hold the 5.5 and see how this is evolving, and then as we have our legislative meetings, bring it up. That's going to be a proposed dialogue that most likely is going to happen. So, Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Thank you, Chair. So if I understand, and this, I'm just going to put this question out there. It's the Our Schools Now initiative, those individuals behind it that created the TSSA in conjunction with the legislature. And when they allocated the 65, or when they put it into that, there was no determining factor on how to be transparent and accountable to that money, right? So they allocated that until they can come to a consensus, and that's why that money was released this last summer. It was given to the districts because they had not pinpointed exactly what to do and how to trace that money. Now, if it moves from the WPU, that means we're going to be sacrificing growth, because that's where the money goes into is growth, correct? And in sustaining, no, am I wrong?
No, growth is separate.
Goes to separate,
They are
okay.
separate.
Okay, so just
Let's-
correct me where I'm wrong,
Okay.
in my understanding.
I think the one thing that I would indicate is that our LEAs are accountable for the funds that they're being given. The accounts were created and the funding mechanisms were created, and then the distribution methodology was determined at the end. And so the account structure is still intact, and funds that go into that TSSA account are still intact. It's just whether additional funds will go in to grow that account. The distribution methodology that was determined last year was one time, and that was to put the funds in flexible allocation. Our LEAs are reporting on how they spend those funds, so there is some
Okay, so
accountability.
they are
They
reporting.
are reporting
Yes.
on
Okay, so
transparency.
I didn't know that. So what would be the downside taking from the WPU and putting in the TSSA? What are we losing there?
I think the biggest differentiation from my perspective is who decides how those funds are spent and where they go. So in the WPU, they go to local school boards to be prioritized for local decisions. They're largely unrestricted, except for educational purposes. In the TSSA, right now, under the current proposed language, there's a plan that's put together at the school level, and the school makes the decisions with board input, their local board input, in a framework as to how those funds are distributed. I
Okay.
don't know which one is better or worse. They're just a differentiation in who decides.
So one more follow-up, if I
Okay.
may. So what will the districts lose? Growth potential?
Well, let's just,
What?
what
I
do they
think-
want? USBA
Yeah.
was standing behind that initiative last year and was part of the negotiations. That's Utah School Boards Association, was behind the negotiations before it went onto the ballot, along with superintendents and that education community was behind the old program that didn't make it on the gas tax, which basically was trying to make sure or have some assurances that the money got right into the schools. It didn't get hung up in other places, and they're trying to get it to teachers' salaries and a few other programs at the principal level. The relationships that happened after that failed that were on the Hill from our schools now, they say, okay, now let's go to Plan B because that failed. And so they're still trying to get money into the schools. And we haven't been in the past invited to the table, but I am more than sure, really, really soon, we're going to get asked to come to the table, see a bill, participate in the discussion, which still gets money down into the school level, but it's not through the WPU as we proposed in our budget. So that's what we're up against. Do we still come back? Do we just all go in and stay on the 5.5, or do we get into some discussion later with board approval in one of our legislative meetings or something of that nature to try to be a part of that solution? Or do we ostracize ourselves and stay and say, hey, we're hanging on the 5.5? I'm not saying there's a threat or anything, but do we want to be at the table to help make that money? Because there is a lot of momentum and horsepower behind the TSSA. The end result is, most likely, you won't have a 5.5 WPU, because it's not going to be 5.5 WPU and this. And so there's almost a compromise, and I guess that, am I missing this at all?
I think so too, but and to answer your question, what do they lose? I'm not sure, like from a funding perspective, they lose anything. I think what it amounts to is to Natalie's point, what purposes the funding goes for, and who determines is what's at play here.
And that's the
yeah,
key.
so I'm not sure if they lose any money because we don't, say they say, well, we'll increase the value of the WPU 4%, but then 1.5% will go, or X amount of dollars, which is the equivalent of a 1.5% increase to the WPU, will go into the TSSA. I think those are the decisions that are being talked about right now. To the superintendent's point, there's been no indication right now of how much is going to get funded. So to say, well, you would lose this amount of money or anything, I think that's we're too early on in the process for that. It's just how it gets, or who decides how the money gets spent.
And I think that's the concern, is if it takes the USBE out of the discussion of how, or of how it's allocated, what it goes to, and it puts it in the hands of, I'm going to say it, crony capitalists, of how they want it used in the public school systems. I think there's a huge problem of accountability there.
Okay. Let me go real fast to Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
So my intent in bringing this up wasn't to discuss the merits of the TSSA versus the WPU, because personally I think the WPU adds the maximum amount of flexibility for LEAs to use that funding in the way they want. But I think it's just the reality that this account is there, and what negotiation power do we want to give our superintendency as they're moving through that process, and instead of like stamping our heels and saying no, 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 how much opportunity do we want to have so we can have that discussion at the table? I think it's recognizing that this, when we talk about general control and supervision of education, the legislature, this is their job, right? The funding of education is their wheelhouse, period, right? And so when we have an opportunity to speak to and for, and the opportunity to be at that table, I think it's an opportunity to take and to use, but not to say, we want it one way or not another, because they're having these discussions with a large population, not just us. And so it's how do we provide the maximum flexibility in our requests so that we are at the table in those discussions. And that's why I bring this up, not to say one is better than the other, but just to maximize our opportunity for a voice.
Well, I'm glad Brittany's brought it up, because this is what's going to be, it's right on the, not even on the horizon, it's right before us, and most likely will be conversations next week, and do we ostracize ourselves from that conversation by just holding to the 5.5, or do we say, well, let's see what this is like, let's try to get involved, we want to make sure it's good for education, good for public education, our fingerprints are on something, that our board needs to know what it looks like as this is maturing, and then bring it to our board. I think that's where we're at. We're still back to, do we try to take a seat at the table and see what it looks like, and kind of start through that process and advise the board, or do we not? Okay, Board Member Davis.
I think that we can do both. I think that we can hold to our 5.5 ask, and we can also ask for a seat at the table to discuss the parameters. I think that there are pros and cons to what is on the table currently. I know I can think of a very specific change that I would request right now to what's drafted on the table, or what they're talking about at least. And I think that once that gets fleshed out, then we can make a decision if we want to alter what we are, supporting or asking for. But I wouldn't give away the 5.5 ask. I just don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that we can ask, and we should ask for both.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen.
I'm all for keeping our seat at the table to negotiate, and I think that maybe the time for that is as this develops. We have these weekly meetings, and maybe that's the time to look into it and see. But I need Scott to help me and just make sure I'm understanding this right. Are the dollars aren't necessarily equivalent from the TSSA account to the WPU account if we think about next year, right? Because if we build it in the WPU and then we increase it next year, it'll be built into the base.
Right.
So we're trading, if we think about future
Yeah, that's a good
value,
point, yeah.
we're trading away dollars that are worth more in the future for
Okay.
dollars
And
that are
that-
one time, basically.
I see, and that
this
could
year.
go to Board Member Cummins' question too. What do we lose? But from our vantage point as staff right now, that's the decision is, who decides where it goes for, and in what mechanism or method, I guess, distribution method. So yeah, good point, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Board Member Belknap.
Thanks, Chair. I actually have appreciated this discussion and think that it would be most appropriate to try and hold true to the 5.5. However, I'd really like to open the door to our leadership and our leadership of the board and of the office to move and be a little more nimble as needed, so that money's not lost, but they have the ability to negotiate on either way.
Board Member Bolter.
So I'm just trying to understand, if I can just clarify with Board Member Brittany Cummins. So we're discussing whether or not we want to come and talk about negotiations, possibly reducing our WPU and putting some of that money into the TSSA. Is that kind of, and just like see if we're willing to negotiate, basically, so that we could go to the table?
No, I don't think that's what's being said.
Oh.
What's being really said
I don't
is,
know.
most like, they're going to probably ask for that later, but can we
Oh,
go
okay.
to, can we be to the
Well,
table and work on this?
I'd like to be at the table and work on it.
TSSA, as it's moving forward, advocating for our board priorities, our goals and objectives. But we just need to know, it's important for you to know, and this is in the public side, that outside of this conversation, it was like, well, if we go this way, then the WPU can swing
Okay.
down a little bit. There's only so many dollars in the pot, but we would never say, okay, nobody is asking to have us move off of the 5.5, but most likely,
It
as
could
this
happen.
gets closer, we might be
Okay.
changing that depending on total number of dollars that are coming in.
Well, I'd rather us be at the table and have this discussion.
Is that where you think, I mean, that's your question. That's my question too, but Vice Chair Brittany Cummins?
Yeah, and I'd like to maintain the 5.5, like the actual revenue, the new revenue spent in that general area. I think we should maintain that request. I think in the long run, it's understanding that it's not our decision to make, right? And so we need to be cautious as to how we put our foot forward, as if like this is our say, but really advocating for the maximum amount of flexibility for LEAs in the WPU, but recognizing that as we talk about those things, that we recognize that there are some legislators who are looking at the TSSA count as a way to funnel new revenue into schools, and that we not close our eyes to that new account and that new revenue stream. And that's all I'm saying.
Board Member Linda Hansen?
As I recall conversations I had with Ursa last year, the Rural Schools Association, for those of you guys who are new. It seemed to me that they were told that the TSSA funds may disappear every year, that it may not be something that they have all the time. But it seems to me like the WPU, you know, like, kind of like Scott said. And so I think we'd certainly be better to get WPU money for them than TSSA. But if you know, I agree with Laura that I think we need to be flexible as well.
Board Member Davis?
If we are allowed a seat at the table, how would be the best method of communication if board members have specific ideas to be expressed or shared? Like, would that happen through a board vote? Would individual members talk to the staff who are participating? How do we want that to transpire?
Normally something, when the total board is behind it, that it comes before the board, and that's why we have our legislative meetings to talk about those on the content and that. As staff is looking at, and this is what our staff will do, they do their very best to represent the best interests of the board from data to well, just all aspects of public education. But the final say is still to the board. But if you have a suggestion or you see something that's going that way, I would recommend that you shoot something to the superintendent and also to leadership, and then we will follow up on that. If it still meets the context of our goals and objectives, but still the final say on this, the work in progress can continue, but when the board is totally behind something, it happens in a board meeting. So there's, yeah, do you want to comment on?
So I think today's computer science discussion is a good example of your question, in that there was a bill going down the track with general education funding, and so we were kind of on the parameter of that discussion. Certainly we had staff involved. I sit on the Talent Ready Utah board, so you know, I had the general concept and knew that the board would be supportive of our involvement to that level. Within just a few days, that funding flipped, and so we inserted ourselves into the conversation to give the board a much bigger role with education funding, and a lot of negotiation took place. And then we brought it before you today to say this is where this is at and the board's role in it. We would not have time to check in with you and get consensus every step of the way along that that dialogue and negotiations, and things happened really fast. And that's the way it happens up there. So to your question, which I think is so important about having a seat at the table, we feel very fortunate that we have that seat now, and we have a good relationship with our legislative partners, so they ask us a lot. What helps us is we always advocate for the board's priorities, always. That's primary. And then if there's a big shift in the wind, we come back to you and say, look, this is where things are at. How do you feel? But there are always times where we're called on to make decisions on the fly. So when we know where your priorities are or where you want to shift, that's very helpful. But 15 of you have 15 different perspectives. So it's a little bit challenging for staff when we get one of you as an individual saying, I think this should happen. It's certainly helpful for us to know how each of you feel as individuals and points to consider, because we can't work in isolation. But when it's a big lift, we need to come to you and get your collective approval so that we feel confident that we've got your back collectively moving into some of these bigger negotiations. Does that help?
Thank you, Superintendent.
But please don't hesitate to talk to us if you have an idea. It's just that sometimes individual board members get disappointed when we don't act on their idea because somebody has a competing idea. I know. So anyway, I just want to put that out there.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen.
And I'm just a rookie here, and maybe you can help me. I'm having a little bit of a hard time when we laid out our priorities, and we're asking now for maybe some leeway for the board or for the staff to do some negotiating. But to have that all come out in an open meeting just seems like we've given away our position, early on, and the negotiation, they know the bottom line already that we've given. I don't know if there's another way to do that or how you feel about that, but I'd be interested in hearing the comments.
No, I think we're at every table we want to invite ourselves to, and they welcome us, but I find it whenever I want to reach out on any issue that I can get the attention of whoever's writing the bill. But on this particular situation, this is pretty big, and we were not at the table in the past. And I know there's an opportunity for us to invite ourselves to the table, and I know through appropriations and everything else, they're going to say, okay, because it seems like appropriations has really got our back. And other legislators are saying, where do we stand on this? So we can come to the table and talk through something. I've seen a lot of really good betterments happen over the last couple of years in hostile environment. But I think it's real important that we're having this discussion openly, because there's not another place to talk about it. You can't go into an executive session, but it's just all part of our budget and what is part of the legislative process, and so it's good to hear from the board and get a consensus of what's most important to you and where we should have staff and others where we should be on this. So a lot of stuff's predictable. We're pretty predictable.
And I understand that they're going to come after us, and we're going to have to give probably on the WPU. And for today, I think that I'm comfortable.
They may ask us, and then we may say no, but at least we're at the table and moving this other thing, and then we can make a choice. We may come back and say, oh, this is really good. I think we'll change our priorities. Who knows? It's our priorities.
Yeah.
It's our list.
So today, as far as general direction, I think that I hear kind of a consensus that the WPU is important to us because it maintains flexibility and future growth. But push comes to shove, we'll certainly take any money, but we don't want to do an even trade TSSA money for WPU money if we don't have to.
We're not being asked to do that, but I know that it's out there that it's competing, and as a fund. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Yeah, and I would like to just, sorry, it's getting worse, but speak to your concern, speak to Board Member Hansen's concern about the negotiation power and public meeting, and I don't want this to be looked as if we actually have negotiation power, because that's not the case, right? And so the public setting really is an appropriate place for us to have this conversation, because then when, Scott and Deputy Superintendent Jones and Superintendent Dixon are in a meeting and they come out and they say, here's where we're at on the WPU, then we recognize that there is flexibility in this process. There is every year. It changes quickly. It changes rapidly. I mean, even bills that come out that we choose to support have fiscal notes on them, and so we have to change our priorities on occasion. And so it is a very public process, and so it's not to be meant that we actually have negotiating power, but that we have that conversation publicly that says, are we willing to have this conversation, or are we just very much publicly stating that 5.5 in the WPU or nothing, right? And so that's why I wanted to open this up, because these guys speak to our priorities exactly as they're written, and so we need to make sure that we give them exactly what it is that we want them to speak to, and that's how we come to this process. So can I make a motion about something separate?
Yeah, that's why you have it.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Was Cindy wanted to talk to this topic?
I don't know if you're going to make a motion first or not, but, would it be feasible? We have a meeting on Thursday to have a member, whoever it is, to come and flesh out the current ask with the TSSA, and like which percentage they're saying can go to teacher salary and which percentage can go to the reading, and the way that they've worked on it, and then can we have a conversation and move forward, or would that be too late?
Go ahead.
Just speaking to the process, the bill that's going to speak to the distribution is different than the appropriation process. So the appropriation and the decisions that are made in appropriations happen earlier than this. I don't know when the bill will end up passing. It could be the last day or whatever. And so I'm just saying they're two different topics, the appropriation conversation and then the distribution formula that's in the TSSA account. And so that's all. Correct. And so like I said, I'm not saying we should discuss the merits of the different accounts and what's better or worse. I'm just saying we need to be open that this is a reality of the conversations that are going on right now about appropriating money into the WPU versus the TSSA account. So can I make a separate motion?
You bet.
I'd like to move that we add to our priority list $7,150,000 for the computer science initiative.
What was the amount again? 7,150,000 to the priority list. That's computer science. Do we have a second? Second. Discussion to the motion. Board Member Lear.
So where would you propose that come? Can I ask a question to Vice Chair? Can I ask a question to Vice Chair Cummins?
Yeah, what's your question? And
Well,
the question goes to the whole board,
Oh.
and we'll get someone to answer, which might be her.
Well,
So the question from
I'm
Board
just-
Member Lear
because
is,
it's her motion, I was thinking that
she can speak to her
Okay.
motion.
I will. So where would you propose that 7 million comes from?
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
So as an ongoing request, so this list that we have before us has not been prioritized yet. My motion right now is just to add it to the list,
To ongoing.
as an ongoing request.
On top of all
of what we
our
have
other-
currently. And then we, as a board, have the opportunity to prioritize our list.
We haven't prioritized.
I get that. Can I ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Does anyone else, or does Scott, or do you think it's realistic that we'll get $7 million more on top of what else we've asked for?
Okay, Superintendent Dixon.
This is a very high-profile bill, and so there's a likelihood it will get funded because industry is behind it. The governor's office has prioritized this. So this is one of those that it should show up on your list somewhere to show that the board cares about computer science. But we always go in with more requests than there's money for. So that's why your prioritization helps us determine what you value. And they get our whole list, and then they'll say, what does the board value most on this list? So that's why priority is helpful. Everybody comes with more asks than there's money available, always.
Thank you.
Okay, Board Member Hanson. Oh, Scott.
I
did
have
you
to
wanna-
check to make sure I'm the same, right, Hanson.
Okay, Scott, did you?
No, you're up, ma'am.
Yeah.
Okay,
Are
sorry.
you the right Scott?
I'm
I don't
Jones.
know.
Board Member Hanson, why don't you go with your question?
I just had a comment about this. I didn't comment on it earlier this morning, but when we went to a conference a couple of years ago, and when this presentation was made about computer science, and I think I sent you guys, those of you who are on the board then, the URL so you guys could watch it. The legislators that were there with us at the conference told us then if we didn't pass something that required computer science in all the schools, that they were gonna do this, that they were gonna find a way to do it. And so I'm with Sid. I think they're determined to do this. I think this will pass. And so I would rather us be on board than not be on board. That's just my thought.
Okay, the motion before the board is that the board add to our priorities computer science asks of the $7,150,000 ongoing. Any other discussion to the motion? Board Member Ellis.
I am a believer in computer science. I am not, however, a believer in the force requirement that we tend to end up putting on different programs because everything is awesome. And we run out of time in the day to give everything that's awesome to everybody. But I also am really concerned with the funding being switched from the general fund to the ed fund, and so I'm not going to support it. But
Okay, any other comments to the motion? Okay, seeing none, we're going to vote. I'll restate the motion, and the motion is to add to our priority list the computer science ask of $7,150,000 on the ongoing. Discussion to them.
This might seem really simplistic, but I guess my question is, if it's something that's going to pass anyway and it feels like a big priority, why do we need to add it to, just so that we look like we're on board? Or, I mean, because something's going to be taken away, and if we say we want this and this and this, they're going to pass that anyway. I mean, somebody help me.
Superintendent Dixon.
Yeah.
So the negotiations that went on to get you an important seat at the table to drive this project, to not prioritize it would be kind of be all for naught.
Okay, we're going to vote on this, and I'm going to restate the motion again, and the motion is to add to our priority funding request, computer science at $7,150,000 of ongoing. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Well, the ayes, raise your hand. We have Board Member Scott Nielsen, Board Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Gravitt, Board Member Lear, Board Member Newell, Board Member Belknap, Board Member Hansen, Board Member Davis, Board Member Cannon, Board Member Vice Chair Cummins. Do you need the nays?
Yeah.
The nays? Do you have the nays? No. Okay, then the nays. Board Member Earl, Board Member Lisa Cummins. Was there more nays? I'm asking the nays to Board Member Bolter, Board Member Ellis. Okay, motion passes. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Okay, I've already changed my address and moved because I know that this motion is going to give me a pie in the face. But I'd like to move that we remove the school nurses priority from our budget priorities, and not because I don't value this, but I think our request for the schools, safe and healthy schools, is a very large ask, which includes those requests and those needs for LEAs to make those decisions in their schools. And so that is my motion. In a very quiet voice.
Nobody's going to treat you for that.
I know.
Okay, we have a motion to remove the school nurses from our priority list. Is there a second? To remove. Do we have a second? Okay, any one of them. Discussion to the motion. You want to speak to your motion?
No, I think
your
I
light
already
was
did.
still on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, no.
Oh, okay. Board Member Davis?
Sorry, I have to speak against the motion. I just have heard from far too many teachers and aides that are being asked to take care of serious medical needs in schools, and our school nurses are spread far too thinly. And I think it's just an accident waiting to happen at some point. So
Okay.
I'm speaking against the motion.
Board Member Lear?
And I also have to speak against the motion with no violence intended, Brittany, or anticipated. But if I have to balance technology against the health and safety, literally and figuratively, because I think school nurses can contribute to the mental health of our children, I will choose health and safety every time. And I know that the amounts are nowhere near equal, and interestingly, when I had school nurses in the back of my mind when I asked where I thought that money might come from. So I have to oppose this motion, and I will continue to support however small the amount of money is for school nurses, because I think they are so crucial. It's so counterintuitive to take one penny from the discussion of mental and physical safety of our children.
Board Member Belknap.
I actually really appreciate this because it puts the onus back to the school districts to decide if they're going to get $30 million ongoing money to decide what they're going to do, whether they're going to do a school nurse or a psychologist. They get to decide what they're going to do with that money rather than us earmarking it and choosing for them. So I like this and putting our eggs in a basket of school safety altogether. Thanks.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
And I just want to say that this was a motion that I was planning on making prior to me hearing about the technology. So this wasn't me attempting to balance some budget, because we don't have a budget to balance, right? These are requests. And so this was basically just, we have a very large ask for our safe and healthy schools, and I prioritize that as one of our number one asks this year. And so I think it's just a little bit interesting that we would pull out one aspect of safe and healthy schools and ask for an additional funding for it when we've asked for a large fund for safe and healthy schools. And to really prioritize and safeguard that request is why I'm making this motion.
Okay. Board Member Scott Nielsen.
Yeah, I move the previous question.
Okay. Going to end debate. Okay. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Okay. The motion. Did we get? I didn't hear one. There was no lights on the phone. Okay. Well, I thought I might have didn't hear something over there. Okay. The motion before the board is to remove school nurses from our board priorities. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. Well, the ayes raise their hand. Board Member Scott Nielsen, Board Member Earl, Board Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Newell, Board Member Belknap, Board Member Hansen, or Board Member Linda Hansen, Board Member Ellis, Board Member Bolter, Board Member Lisa Cummins, and Vice Chair Brittany Cummins. The motion passes. Do you need the nays? Okay. What's that? I want the nays. The nays, raise your hand. Okay. Then the nays is Board Member Gravitt, Board Member Lear, Board Member Davis, and Board Member Cannon. So Scott, we still have another. I mean, you're probably just hanging there. Do you have more input on things, or are we to the point where we've got to put our priorities?
I think we're right along where we need to be, where we're getting this and thinking about it. The next big event is going to be, and I'm anticipating it next week. I mean, obviously I couldn't speak for the legislature, is when Executive Appropriations Committee releases the revenue and says, this is how much revenue you've got. And then that's when we start this, we go in, so, maybe they say, well, for public education, it's 300 million, or 350, or, we just don't know yet. But when that starts, the turnaround is quick. I mean, that's, so next week when we get into that, and that goes, I think, to Vice Chair Cummins' point about, we'll all be up on the Hill, and when that information comes out, that's really what will drive it even better and faster, is when that revenue is identified. So I think it's good to think about this, where you're at with the WPU. The other thing I'd just add is, with the WPU, that's, the flexibility of it too, but then there's the sustainment aspect of it, right? When you start getting into appropriations that are for specific purposes, it's, I guess, much easier to eliminate those in the future than it would be to basically, devalue the WPU. So that's just a normal consideration, is when you balance, your request for the WPU and, when we start to talk about specific line item appropriations or different things like that. So, but the key catalyst is going to be once we know for sure how much revenue we have to work with. And that's probably going to come next week. So.
Okay, we're done.
Chair, that's it.
Okay, board members, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Okay, 10 minutes means 25 till. who doesn't have who needs to borrow a watch? Oh, hang on. Board Member Linda Hansen.
I just wanted to remind everybody that that amendment is there on
Oh, thank you.
R277495 now. If you want to take a look at it and read through it, it's under my name, but
The
it's-
final, yeah. the
It's
final.
there, yeah, if you guys want to look at it.
Okay, thank you. 10-minute break. So we're going to round you up.